Hello and welcome. My name is Gabriel Ellis, and I'm your host of the Curious Mind podcast. I'm a psychologist, a therapist, and a philosopher. My interest is in this podcast to reflect on everyday topics in a deeper way, because often enough I find that topics that are relevant to our lives, to our relationships, to work, to our mental health are dealt with, especially in social media, in a superficial way. And in my experience, my personal life, and also in my clinical work, I can always see how deeply rooted uh, and complex phenomena are that everything that it basically pertains to our normal life has a deep layer. And I think that without understanding those phenomena in depth, we will always be trapped in a cycle of trying to apply simple but unsustainable solutions to actually complex issues. What I want to talk about today is the topic of shame. It has gained some popularity, I think, over the past years, especially through the work of Brené Brown. And I wanted to put it in a bigger context. And bigger context for me always means that I reflect on and I research what other thinkers who were quite well versed with the mind had to say about these phenomena. And thus try to contextualize it in a meaningful way for you so that next time when you reflect on it, when you hear about it, so that you have a little bit more background to base your further discussion on. As most philosophical topics, we can always rely on Plato and Socrates to have contributed to this. And Plato, in particular, had a very specific idea about shame, which, by the way, he shares with Immanuel Kant, who basically had a similar perspective as Plato, which is that shame is an aspect of the inner compass of our mental life. Shame for Plato and for Socrates is the reaction of the soul when we recognize that we have acted against our own good reason, against the good inside of us. So basically, there is an understanding in Plato and in Socrates that we have an internal knowledge, a divine knowledge, so to speak, those Platonic ideas about how things are and how things are good and well. This is the source of virtues. And shame for them is a good thing because it helps us to connect with the morality inside of us, the divine morality inside of us, and helps us to restrain the unhealthy and the excessive desires inside of us. So for them, shame is a good thing. And especially when you keep in mind that philosophy in the old days always had a perspective and a component of contributing to society, to the social environment around us, shame has the particular function of keeping us in check against the greedy, the aggressive elements inside of us that always threaten to impair and to reduce the social cohesion, the glue, so to speak, that holds us together working as a society. So we'll keep that in mind and we'll come back to this position later on because obviously it's not a point that I think is widely shared today. And today we'll look at phenomena like shame in a very different light. One of the main followers and students of Plato was, of course, Aristotle, who for many centuries was considered to be the greatest of the ancient Greek philosophers. And without good reason, I think he has been largely, maybe not forgotten, but neglected. He was a great thinker. Uh, he didn't contribute that much to the philosophy of shame, but for him, for Aristotle, he regards shame less as a stable virtue in itself, but more as an affect, as an emotion, and specifically as the fear of a bad reputation. For him, especially in the young, shame helps to restrain impulses. So, in that respect, he agrees with Plato and with Socrates. But for him, in mature, virtuous adults, shame has no specific reason anymore. It should hardly occur because virtuous adults already do the right thing. They don't need a monitor, they don't need a censor that keeps the passions in check because they have already achieved virtue. Uh, there is the next philosopher that I want to add here is Baruch de Spinoza. He was a Dutch philosopher, and he, in the medieval times, and he was, sorry, it was in the modern times in the 18th century. And he was interesting in the sense that he brought in a quite psychological perspective. For him, shame is a form of sadness that arises when we believe others disapprove of our actions. And since shame weakens a person's power of action, this was for him the most important point. Shame makes a person dependent on the opinions of others, which is for him not a virtue. This power of action, this personal power, for Spinoza was the most important uh, thing, the source of virtue. To limit this power, to make people inhibited, to make them anxious, is not an expression of virtue. And so a free person must realize the truth in things, and thus they base their motivations in reason, not in fear, and not in fear of social condemnation, which shame particularly contributes to. For Spinoza, an effect which brings suffering, and this is important psychologically because it's part of the foundation of modern psychology and therapy. An effect which brings suffering ceases to cause suffering as soon as we form a clear and rational understanding of it. So when we feel suffering, according to Spinoza, we apply our sense of reason, we imply our understanding, which is not just intellectual. And once we have understood it, once we grasped it, we are free from the suffering aspect in it because we have penetrated it, we have understood it. So shame is a source of weakness. It is, in that sense, irrational. And once we have understood what shame is, what it makes us do, what healthy ways are to achieve the same positive goals, what healthy ways are to get rid of the negative effects of shame, then it becomes integrated in reason, and then it contributes to our personal power. But Spinoza was realistic enough to know that if irrational men felt no shame, that then there would be little that would hold them together because not all humans, not all people uh, are particularly driven towards rationalizing, grasping, deeply understanding their passions and their feelings, the things that weaken them. So for him, this path of reason, the path of deep understanding is unfortunately reserved to a few. And so he concedes that shame has a particular position in our society. Shame is good insofar as it gives people a desire to live decently, even without fully understanding the irrational aspects in it. Then we come to Nietzsche, the great philosopher of the 19th century. For him, freedom, and it's difficult to summarize Nietzsche, but freedom is one of his key topics. He wanted to be free himself, he wanted to free people through his philosophy. For him, freedom meant to no longer being ashamed before oneself. This is taken from his book, The Gay Science. The meaning is that whoever is ashamed before himself, shame is, of course, a negative emotion that arises inside of us. Whoever is ashamed before himself is still a slave. A slave to what? A slave to foreign values and judgments of other people, of parents, of society, of religion, for example. But true freedom means accepting one's own nature without the internalized self-hatred. So for Nietzsche, this shame is a sickness because it weakens the individual. And here he clearly relates to the idea of Spinoza, who was first in highlighting this aspect, which we consider today as quite a modern perspective on shame. Shame is a sickness that weakens the individual for Nietzsche, and we should get rid of it because ultimately Nietzsche saw as a vision for people that they live by their own laws, by their own rational understanding, by their own responsibility, and this inflicted shame, which we internalize from parents, family, friends, society, has no place in this idealized world of Nietzsche. Now let's jump to a important and influential yet somewhat obscure psychoanalyst, Jacques Lacan. He developed his ideas beginning from the 30s, but most importantly, the 50s and 60s in France. And he had quite a specific understanding of the human mind, of desires, and all of these complex feelings. What he said about shame is it's the feeling that one feels for a moment in that one ceases to be fake. So we have our facade, we have our social persona, and in that we're trying to be somebody who we would like to be it for our own ideas and purposes, the person that I would like to see myself as, or we want to please others, or we are afraid of the judgments. But in any case, there is often a sense of fakeness, a sense of performance, of wishful thinking in our behavior. And when that facade falls, in that moment, we are exposed, we are naked, and in this seeing this nakedness, we feel the shame. By the way, with this understanding, he nicely connects to a philosopher that I don't mention today, but I've dealt with a lot in past episodes, which is Hegel. And for Hegel, this was an important aspect. Shame appears when I see myself naked, and he connects that, for example, to the story of Genesis, when after eating the apple from the forbidden tree, Adam and Eve can see that they are naked, and then they're ashamed, and then they want to cover themselves. So Lacan kind of connects to this set of ideas around shame that comes from Hegel. And saying it again, shame is what we feel when we see ourselves in a moment of nakedness, because then we drop this facade of who we like to be, how we like to see ourselves in, the narrative, the story that we tell ourselves we are, that we're good, bad, and so on. And we see ourselves maybe through the eyes of others, but we see ourselves in our nakedness. And then this is kind of a shock. This is kind of a reality. And then we're ashamed of it. Another quote by Lacan is that shame is the response to be seen in my nakedness as an object. Here he puts this quite frankly, what I was talking about right now. And a third quote by Lacan, we live in a world, and this he said in 1972, we live in a world that has liquidated shame, but whoever no longer has shame no longer has access to the truth of desire. Now, this is important for Lacan. The whole idea of desire is crucial for Lacan. For us, for him, we as subjects are subjects of desire. And desire for him is quite a complex thing. It is connected to the recognition by another. It can be society, it can be specific people. It can, of course, be the parents by whom we were raised. And there is a complex dynamic in desire. It's both something inside of us and it drives us, it motivates us, and at the same time, it is a lack. It is something that is missing. And this missing, this lack, creates in us a strive. We want to fill a hole, a bottomless hole, because we can never fully satisfy our needs. And here he argues that when we live a shameless life, when we liquidate shame, that we forget to see something crucial about desire. Shame exposes that we have not reached, for example, who we are, who we want to be, who others want to be. And if we can live in a state of shamelessness, then we forget to deal with this existential situation of being some sort of a lack or um, developing around a center of lack and becoming this complex person in the process. And so we can live in a fantasy land when we have lost our shame. To live with shame, to take shame as a source of self-understanding and self-growth, allows us to situate ourselves as humans, as subjects of desire and as subjects of lack. Now, this sounds all complex. What it means, I think, without trivializing it, uh, the effects of shame, the feelings of shame, allow us an insight into our own complexity. It helps us to grow. And when we raise children, youths, and again, this was said in 1972, where France had to deal with the fallout of the students' revolution or students' movement in the late 1960s, when it was perceived that many people have lost their sense of shame, then it is an obstruction to us becoming more mature because we are stopping, in a way, a self-development that necessarily is built around an understanding of our structures of desire, of what we want, of what we need, and that partially we can never achieve what we actually want or need for ourselves. It's worth looking into it. There are books around, of course, the philosophy of Lacan. And if you're interested, I don't claim that it's easy to understand, but to make small steps in the understanding of this dialectic, of this complexity around desire and of shame for Lacan, I think is quite worthwhile for people who are interested in psychology. Okay, now come to a modern intellectual, Brené Brown, who has popularized, I think, part of the discussion around shame. For her, she distinguishes between guilt and shame. For her, guilt means that I did something bad, and shame means that I am bad, and that this, of course, is a problem. To do something bad can always be rectified by an understanding of what I did and by doing it better next time. If I am bad, or if I consider myself to be bad, or others consider me to be bad, then there's something irreparable about this. Then there's a sense of brokenness in that. And that, of course, creates a lot of pain when people live their life with such an understanding that they're somehow broken or fundamentally deficient. Here's a quote that I don't know how literal it is, but it's relatively close. Of Brown: shame is the intense, painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. So, this is exactly what I tried to describe. This understanding of me being fundamentally flawed is a source of never-ending pain and grief for people. So, in that respect, it's understandable that it was important for her to contribute to people stop feeling that they are deficient. So she argued, she was advocating building up a shame resilience so that we don't feel this sense of fundamental deficiency anymore. She conceded that we cannot completely eliminate shame, but uh, the right countermeasure is to become resilient towards it. And for Brown, this happens in four steps. First step is to recognize the triggers, to recognize my physiological reactions when a situation properly labeled as shame occurs. The second is to understand and to investigate how that shame comes from unrealistic social and societal expectations. This is what is behind the mental framework that creates shame. It's social values, it's social norms with their expectations, and those expectations can never be fulfilled. And so, inevitably, again and again, I experience situations where shame arises in me with the invitation to think that I'm fundamentally deficient. The third step for her is to speak about it, to stop this taboo, to bring it into conversation, and to eliminate the important aspects around the silence of it, the taboo of it. So for her, shame thrives in secrecy and in silence and in judgment, and it dies when it is spoken about. So speak about it. The fourth step, finally, is to talk about shame with the right people, with people that we trust. And the people we have trust in, they will shower us, they will contribute with empathy, because, of course, most typically the things that we are ashamed of, the behaviors, when we're goofy, when we've embarrassed ourselves, when we had thoughts that are difficult, problematic, judgmental, and so on, other people have experienced similar things. And so when we talk to people that we can trust and those trusted friends express their empathy, they can share that they have experienced something similar as well. And this gives me the understanding, this gives me the insight that I'm not fundamentally deficient, that I'm sharing my uneasiness with wanting to be good or wanting to be perfect with a good part of humanity, that my friends have similar experiences. And so it normalizes what I went through, it normalizes the pain that I went through. And again, it helps me to understand that what is behind the shame are unachievable expectations, typically infused in us by parents, family, circles of friends, media, society, and so on. For her, vulnerability, the vulnerability to express, to understand, and to think about the triggers of shame and the shame in general, vulnerability is not a weakness. It's the only path to courage. So, courage, another antidote to cope with those shameful situations. And perfectionism, which is a feature that many people have included in their life today, is for her a sign of avoidance, the avoidance to be judged, the avoidance to be shamed. And while the idea of it is honorable, but it does not work. I cannot be perfect, and the collateral damage, the price I pay for wanting to be perfect, is too high. Without the willingness to be vulnerable, and again, the emphasis on vulnerability, for Brown, we cannot build genuine connections with others because we need to understand how unperfect we are, and we have to understand how the others cannot be perfect as well. And so this allows us, the acknowledgement of imperfection allows us to truly connect because then I can get a glimpse into the real person, the real personality behind the words, behind the actions, and not to be confused by the perfectionism of the facade that people try to apply to their thoughts, to their feelings, to their behaviors and communication. So, to sum it up, for her, shame needs three things to grow. It's again secrecy, it's silence, and it's judgment. And the big antidote for her is empathy. Now, with that, if we connect it to the philosophical the concepts that I described before, she clearly connects with Nietzsche, and in a way, she connects with Spinoza because they emphasize the weakening aspect of it. Nietzsche was a fierce opponent to internalized societal norms and pressures, and Brown picks that aspect up. What she underemphasizes, though, is the aspect of contributing to a society and its norms. And here I think I speak in a more general, I try to address a more general topic, which is how to connect the level of the individual back to society. I think that in the past decades, we have seen a development where we in the industrial West or in the Western world, the Northern Western world, we have become more and more individualized. And as such, we, without knowing it, we have tried to internalize a value system that is closely related to what Nietzsche had in mind, minus the philosophical depth. So we have become more individual. We try to live the life as we want to. And so to rid ourselves from uncomfortable feelings and from societal pressures and of the sense of shame. That had a backlash. If it's not done deeply, and what I mean with deeply is in a way that Nietzsche emphasized in his detailed analysis of power structures, internal power, self-weakening ethics, and so on, but also in the sense of Spinoza. So to remind us again of Spinoza's argument, he was in favor of eliminating pain and suffering through a deep insight into the matter. But he also knew that many people don't have the fortitude, the courage, the insight, the time, the ability, the resources to do that work. And so when this is missing, then we still need a functioning society. We cannot just throw overboard the societal norms that keep our society together. And this aspect, I think we have neglected both in the individual work that psychotherapy does, but also in the reflections on the development of humanity, the raising of children, the school system, and so on. There was more and more emphasis on individuality to free ourselves from societal norms, but without giving us the tools, the understanding, the insight, the courage, and the strength in order to pull it off. It needs this second part in order to really make obsolete the internalized norms of family, peer group, and society. So here I want to speak for and I want to bring back older aspects of social norms uh, in the sense that shame, as expressed by Plato, for example, shame had a function of limiting the passions, limiting the destructive elements within us. When we don't have those kind of virtues, now they considered shame as a virtue, as an expression of the inner compass. When we don't have those virtues, then the destructiveness and the passions take over, and not only will they make the individual do harmful things to society, here I put on a more psychological perspective on this, they will do things that harm themselves. They will not know why it's difficult for them to make friends. They will not know why people pull back from them, why they have difficulties in relationships, at work, and so forth. People who are shameless, I'm simplifying this now, will do harm to themselves and to others. And so to bring back not necessarily shame and the weakening aspect of it, but to bring back the understanding that shame is a cheap method to regulate one's behavior, to prevent us from doing the worst things to ourselves and to others. With doing that, I want to acknowledge that there is a necessary regulation for our mental health and to prevent us from doing harm to others that is connected to to shame and to what is behind shame. So I want to rehabilitate not shame as a feeling, because I couldn't agree more that shame is harmful and weakening, but shame is an expression of something that should be kept in mind when we discuss becoming a law to ourselves, of getting rid of societal norms and just live a life based on oneself. We need to be strong, we need to be courageous, virtuous, insightful in order to live a life without shame. And as long as we don't achieve that, we need some form of regulation that keeps us together as an individual and keeps us connected to the people around us so that we don't have too many destructive elements on our social environment. And with that, I want to end this overview and this discussion. I hope it was interesting to you. Um, like and subscribe if you're interested to see more content like this. And let me know what your thoughts are on shame. Can you connect to my attempt to rehabilitate shame in this modern life that we have that is so individualized? Or do you think there are more effective counter aspects, counter measures that still keep us together in a realistic way without everyone falling apart as an individual? And so I'm interested in the debate around it. Let me know what you think. I hope you come back to watch further episodes in which I will deal again with psychological and philosophical topics. Until then, goodbye.